Good evening, everyone. Welcome to a People for Effective Government online event. We're glad to have you. My name is Jeff Williams. Myself and another PEG board member will be facilitating, taking questions, etc. this speaking event. And my partner in crime tonight is it you, Mark, or Chris? I can't remember. I guess we'll find out as they struggle to come off mute. Anyway, PEG is a nonprofit, Spokane-based nonpartisan coalition. Our mission is to support bipartisan approaches to governing, which are fiscally responsible, ensure an adequate social safety net, and promote a civil society. We've been holding in-person forums and online events for over 3 years. For those who are new to our organization and events, we look forward to having you with us in the future. We are committed to changing the current political climate in which our two major parties have become increasingly polarized. We're working to encourage sincere and civil debate about the challenges that our nation faces and about effective solutions to those challenges by providing speakers with information and perspectives on a variety of relevant topics. We are a small grassroots organization working with very shallow pockets. If you are finding these events helpful, as you think about the issues in government at the local, state, and federal level, please consider joining as a member or making a donation to PEG. We are a nonprofit relying on membership dues and donations to cover our costs. If you are interested in learning more about PEG and possibly becoming a PEG member, please visit our website at www.pegnow.org. As for tonight, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Dr. Brian Hennig from Gonzaga University. He is the Director, Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. The topic tonight is climate change, or more specifically, climate resilience. As we begin to experience increasingly significant effects of a warming planet, from obvious impacts like wildfire, smoke, and extreme heat, to less effects such as increased migration, shifts in precipitation patterns, and warming of rivers and streams, the concept of resilience becomes increasingly important. Climate resilience is the capacity of social, economic, and ecosystems to cope with a hazardous event or trend or disturbance. Spokane Beat the Heat is an initiative designed to help our community understand and respond to the impacts of extreme summer heat. Dr. Brian Hennig is the inaugural director and founder of the Gonzaga Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment. Originally from Boise, Idaho, Dr. Hennig joined Gonzaga's faculty in 2008 and is a professor of philosophy and a professor of environmental studies. He earned a BA from Seattle University and an MA and M philosophy and PhD from Fordham University. An award-winning author, Dr. Hennig has written or edited more than 10 books and 35 articles and chapters, including Riders in the Storm, Ethics in an Age of Climate Change, and Climate Change, Ethics, and the Non-Human World. He has delivered more than 150 talks to general and academic audiences in North America, Europe, and Asia. For more information on this project, please see Gonzaga University's website, www.gonzaga.edu/Center for Climate, Society, Environment. Our work, Climate Resilience Project Beat the Heat. This is all included on our website under events. Without any further introduction necessary, Dr. Hennig, I turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Am I coming through okay?
Hearing you 5 by 5.
Excellent. Well, welcome everybody and good evening. It's nice to be with you tonight. Thanks for having me. I had originally proposed to do a talk related to my work on climate ethics, but then as the weeks and months proceeded, decided to suggest that we spend our time together thinking together a little bit about climate resilience, as Jeff said, and thinking about how, as a community, we can begin to do a better job of planning for the future that we've created for ourselves. As Jeff mentioned, this work is advanced by a new project that Gonzaga started in actually very recently. So I've been at Gonzaga for 15 years, but this project, the Center for Climate, Society, and the Environment, is just new. It started in April of 2021. And it's focused on trying to help the community in our region to better understand the challenges of a changing climate. And so I was hoping to share a little bit with you tonight about what we're up to and what we're about and how you might get involved. So hopefully lots of time for discussion. The Q&A feature looks like it's active there, so feel free to start popping questions in there or in the chat, whatever is easiest for you. Or I believe you can also raise your hand, and I'll defer to Jeff and Mark as to how they'd like to handle the questions. A quick bit about the Climate Center here at Gonzaga. As you can see, our vision here on the screen is pretty broad. We're looking at trying to figure out how Gonzaga can not just study this issue, but really be of practical use to the community in addressing it and responding to it. So our mission is to use our academic expertise to provoke scholarship and teaching, consulting, and capacity building related to that broad intersection of climate, society, and the environment. What that work will become is still being decided in real time with our colleagues across the university in the area. But one of the things that we very immediately were impacted by was the 2021 heat dome here in the Northwest. So that was just not, it's kind of hard giving a talk about heat when it's 27 degrees here in Spokane. But not too long ago, you might remember that we had a pretty nasty summer last summer, but then even worse the summer before. So to refresh your memory, in 2021, we had a really severe heat event, which they called a heat dome, which was in June and lasted for quite an extended period of time with really high temperatures and particularly high evening temperatures that didn't subside as much as they typically do. And this led to a number of deaths in our area, including in our own town here in Spokane. At least 20 deaths were directly attributable to the heat dome here in Spokane County. At least 100 deaths in Washington State, and at least 800 deaths in the inland Northwest, not just the inland, in the Northwest region in general, in Oregon, Washington, and British Columbia. On our website, I'll refer to the link later, but just to give you an idea of some of the spatial distribution, you can go to our website and find a list of some of those deaths. So each of these pins in Spokane County, these red pins, is a heat death, and you can learn about each of the people who, what the circumstances were about their death and how they're distributed across the city. It's pretty remarkable that in the 21st century, people in Spokane are dying of extreme heat. Some were elderly, but some, like this person, were younger. And it's quite a diverse set of reasons why. We're also working with the State Department of Health to try and figure out exactly how many excess mortalities we had during this event and how many emergency room visits were increasing numbers during this period. So we were greatly impacted by this, as I'm guessing you were as well. And so we started to think about what, as an academic project, we could do as Gonzaga to help the community understand and start responding to this. We weren't sure that it wasn't clear that the city was really well prepared for this event. And so we were thinking, how can we begin to help the community to better be prepared for next time? So I think I'd like to show a short clip of a video, and if the audio doesn't come through, let me know, but I think it should work. It's a short vignette from a documentary that was made by a local filmmaker called Megan Kennedy at Rogue Heart Media, made it for the Spokane Climate Project. And this is just a short portion of that video. You can find the whole thing at SpokaneClimateProject.org and watch the whole movie. It's about 20 minutes long. And this is just a segment of that movie that's on heat in Spokane. So if fingers crossed, I'll see if this works.
You know, the scope of the impact, whether it's extreme heat or changes in air quality or changes, the one that worries so many people is changes in vector-borne disease. You know, it's been overshadowed a little bit by the pandemic. I think we clearly understand that there will be no more significant public health opportunity in the 21st century than us all working together to tackle climate change. We know that in urban environments, areas with less resources, less green space are called urban heat islands. They're called urban heat islands for a reason. Those temperatures in those areas can be 5 or 10 degrees Fahrenheit above temperatures in other parts of cities. Clear data now helps us to understand that those areas tend to be in economically disadvantaged parts of our communities. We know from epidemiologic data that the risk across populations is there. We know that air pollution already kills more people worldwide than tobacco smoke. And so we have within our communities here in Spokane a population of people that is being put at risk by the consequences of climate change and global warming. And we have an opportunity as a community to step up, to invest in green space, to care for everyone in our community.
What the Lands Council is doing in partnership with the city and other community organizations is starting up a program called Spokanopy. And this program will work to invest in those communities that have been historically oppressed, planting trees where the community sees that they need to be. These trees will provide shade, lower heating and cooling costs, and we're excited to push forward that vision for the future where no matter what neighborhood you live in Spokane, you can have a safe and healthy environment.
When we consider the findings of the temperature group as far as how much warmer it will be in the summer, and also the considerations about wildfire smoke being more likely to happen in Spokane, then we get really concerned about the impacts that those combined things can have on communities that are under-resourced, for people who live outdoors, for people who work outdoors, for children and athletes who want to play outdoors in the summertime. Then it becomes an issue of who has the opportunity to earn a living, who has the opportunity to be safe. So we really have to be planning about how do we reduce risk and how are we going to prepare so that we keep everyone safe and keep everyone safe in a way that is fair.
Well, temperature increases really concern me. We just had a heat wave and it came on quicker than what it normally does. It was an eye-opening time for a lot of people about how the environment impacts us all. These young people got it early. They are aware, they're engaged. My grandkids are talking to me about stuff that I didn't think about or address till I was much later in my adult life. But it has been normalized for them. You know, protect Mother Earth.
I've really seen this passion from young people who care so much about the environment and climate change and really want to take action to help protect our environment and help solve this crisis that we're currently in.
So the video goes on and it really is worth watching in its entirety. Again, it's about 20 minutes. that gives you a nice overview of some of the concerns of the community and some of the challenges. So the Climate Center launched Spokane Beat the Heat after the 2021 heat dome, and started looking for partners and is finding them all across the community and in the state. And so we've got some nice burgeoning partnerships with the Regional Health District, with the State Department of Health, and an interagency partnership called the Climate and Health Adaptation Initiative, as well as a lot of partners such as the ones mentioned in the video, like the Lands Council and others that I'll mention. So I'd like to just share with you a little bit about what we've been up to since then, and again, what we found and what it might mean for being more prepared as individuals, families, and as a community. So this dense little timeline here gives you a sense as to what we've been up to since February of 2022 in the months after the heat dome. So we're really interested in trying to learn more about what Matt Holland in the video there, Dr. Holland mentioned the idea of an urban heat island. So the first phase of our work, starting in last summer, was trying to get better information about really exactly what kind of urban heat islands do we have in the Spokane area. Can we try and figure out if we can get some actual data to go along with the perception that there are some areas that are warmer than others. And so let's start there. So the first challenge was to get a little bit of funding. So we were able to secure a grant from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration that made it possible to begin to make a project that would allow us to start measuring what the heat differences were between different neighborhoods. We found out about that project from the chief meteorologist at KXLY, Chris Crocker, who sent us that opportunity. And that really gave us a great starting point. It connected us with a number of these national organizations like the Climate Program Office and Heat Watch and Kappa Strategies, as well as the Lands Council, 350 Spokane, and City Council. All ended up developing a really cool partnership of sort of an academic, nonprofit, media, and municipality partnership. And what we did was trying to figure out whether we could measure exactly what kind of heat islands we have in Spokane, and how big of a temperature difference do we have between those green spaces and those the built environment, and then how can we make use of those data in order to be able to make even more useful plans so that we have fewer people dying next time we have an extreme heat event. The basic idea of the heat island is not too difficult to grasp. It's just the idea that, right, you've got this concrete and buildings that retain more heat compared to grassy areas, areas with good tree canopy. And so the goal was to then figure out exactly what that looked like for Spokane. So we worked with a whole bunch of volunteers from across the city this last July. And those 40 volunteers drove 7 different routes, once in the early morning, once in the afternoon, and once in the evening. So each of the 7 routes, 2 people in each route, they drove with these sensors that you see attached to cars. And those sensors would measure temperature, humidity, and records geospatial data each second. And so they gathered 43,000 measurements of temperature and heat, and then that allowed us to create these heat island maps. And the results are pretty interesting. So just to be clear, this is not like measuring temperature over long periods of time, and this is not about trying to figure out what the extreme temperature is over the course of a year or a summer. This is more about taking really careful measurements on one day and looking at how, that day, if it was 85 degrees or 90 degrees that day, how did that get experienced across the city? Was it even or was it uneven across the city? Even though the average might have been 90 degrees, it might have been different in different neighborhoods. And that's exactly what we found. So in the early morning, this is what we found in terms of heat. You'll notice that East Central, that path roughly tracks both the railroad tracks and the freeway going through East Central to Spokane Valley. That's much warmer. And over here down by the river, we have it being much cooler. This is the largest temperature difference. We found an almost 14-degree difference between these cool spaces and East Central. And so at night, it was only getting down this day down to 71.5 degrees. And it was as basically the low temperature in East Central, whereas in other spaces, it was 58.1. It turns out that those evening temperatures are particularly important for heat health. This is what the afternoon looked like. The temperature range moves around a little bit, right? The difference was not as large. So the difference here is more like 8 degrees or so, a little bit more than 8 degrees difference. But you'll notice that on South Hill, where it's really nice and well covered with beautiful trees, you've got it being quite a bit cooler. So if on that day it was 90 degrees for the city, it was actually only 85 degrees in Comstock, Rockwood, or Manitou, whereas it was as high as 93.8 over in West Central, Riverside, and Emerson Garfield neighborhoods. And then in the evening, we found this. So that gives you a sense. And here we get, a 10-degree difference between different neighborhoods. So again, the goal is to figure out where these heat islands are, and so that we can then target those areas with better activities that would help those community members plan, because what we have is unequal effects across the community. This is just some examples here of different communities and how they're affected. So heat actually affects different people. There are certain people that are more vulnerable or less vulnerable. We find in particular that there was a misconception in Spokane that the problem with the heat dome was kind of a summer version of a winter problem. A lot of people saw it as, in the winter, we need warming shelters for unhoused people, and in the summer, we need cooling shelters for unhoused people. And there might be some truth to that, but actually what this shows is actually that the people in our community who are at risk of being harmed by extreme heat are a diverse group of people in our community, as it mentioned in the video as well. You've got some people who, because of their living, work outdoors. If you're working as a roofer, right, that's you work out in the heat and on a roof, you're going to be more vulnerable to extreme heat. Athletes, the elderly are particularly vulnerable. And so what we found when we look at the map of deaths due to extreme heat in Spokane, many of the people who died were elderly, 81, 79, 79, 64, 65, 84, right? Not everybody, but a lot of people were elderly people who had lived through decades and decades of heat events. And in the past, probably had pretty good luck with opening their windows at night, bringing in the cool night air, and then closing those windows in the morning, trapping that cool air, and then shutting their blinds, and they would be okay. And that had worked probably for quite a long time, but then found that during the heat dome, it was not getting cold enough at night. And so that didn't work. And then we had a number of, in particular, elderly residents in Spokane dying. And so that's part of what we wanted to help the community understand, that there are lots of different health effects of extreme heat. And the people who are most vulnerable are actually people with fewer means, people with existing health conditions, very young people, elderly people are all especially at risk of extreme heat. And so when we make plans, our plans need to be focused on how would we help those community members to survive another extreme heat event. So by mapping urban heat islands, we're able to then better understand how heat is distributed in our community. We're in the process of working with the Department of Health to look for ways of making these maps a little bit more useful, so that in addition to be able to knowing how heat is distributed in the city, we'll also be able to add additional map layers that you would be able to toggle on. If you ever played with these GIS maps before, these interactive maps where you could toggle heat and other variables from the census, for example, related to income or age or race or life expectancy or tree canopy. And so you'd be able to look for, and we're going to do some studies on correlations between whether, for example, there are strong correlations between urban heat islands and income level. And there's good reason to suspect that that is likely, and we'll be able to find out now that we've got the data, whether that's the case. So that was phase one, that data collection, pardon me, took place here in July. We started analyzing that data, and we got the maps back last September. So just last month, 2 months ago, I guess it's November now, right? So 2 months ago, we got back the maps that I was just showing you. The next phase of the work then is to understand not only how heat is unevenly distributed across our city, but also how prepared different community members are. And so we launched at the end of last summer, and are still continuing to do a survey of Spokane, just a perception survey, to help better understand how prepared or not prepared different community members are in our community. So this survey is still open. It's about 53 questions. And if you have the time and inclination and you live in the city of Spokane, we would love for you to consider filling it out. In particular, if you have opportunities to share this with community members who are especially potentially vulnerable to extreme heat, we're especially interested in getting their perceptions, and we have it available in a few different languages as a result. But if you go to gonzaga.edu/heat survey, or if you have a mobile device handy, you can scan this QR and fill out the survey. I should mention, and I should have included a graphic there, one of the incentives, if you take the survey, is that you can choose to be eligible for winning either Gonzaga men's basketball tickets or Gonzaga women's basketball tickets. We'll be doing the drawing at the end of this month. So we'll close the survey at the end of November. And so the first week of December, we hope to pick those winners. There'll be 2 winners, 2 tickets on the men's side, 2 tickets on the women's side. So hopefully you'll do this because you think it's important work, but also if this incentive makes a difference, feel free to also fill out the survey for that reason. So again, the goal is to learn about things like, for example, who has an air conditioner and who doesn't. We don't really have good data for the city on how many people actually have an air conditioner. And if they do, is it a window unit or is it central? And if they do have one, can they afford to run it? And so our goal is to get a good enough statistical sample that we'll be able to make some meaningful inferences about just how prepared or unprepared Spokane is. There's some anecdotal evidence, but we don't really have good enough data. And so this survey should, if we do it right, help us to answer that question and many others as well. So if you take phase 1, which was the urban heat island data mapping, and then we then combine that with phase 2, which is the community survey, which we're doing right now, the goal is to combine both of those together to support the city and community partners in making a better plan for future extreme heat events. And so that's really what we're wanting to accomplish. We're not looking to study this for its own sake. We're looking at trying to help community partners, including those in the city government, in order to be able to hopefully develop and expand our current plans so that we have an expanded network, for example, an expanded network of cooling shelters. There's good reason to believe that we need cooling shelters across the city. We probably need them closest to those places where the urban heat islands are. We need them closest to places where people are vulnerable and have the least air conditioning. We need to harden those facilities so that they have their own electrical backup generation. So if the electrical grid is taxed by lots of air conditioning use throughout the city, those facilities, if there are brownouts or blackouts, those facilities would stay running and community members would stay safe. I don't know, an example that is occurring to my mind is similar to my family and I go to the Oregon coast in the summer. And when you go to the Oregon coast, you know when you're in a tsunami evacuation zone. And there are signs everywhere, and the signs alert you to the fact that you're in a tsunami evacuation zone, and they tell you also very clearly on where to go if there is an event. And there should be an analogy of that for heat in Spokane, so that there would be places in the community, hard infrastructure and signs in multiple languages that would tell people this is a cooling shelter. And they would, we're hoping to develop an educational campaign with Spokane Regional Health District that would help people understand when they should make use of that. So we'd love to develop an early warning system. We'd love to develop a system where people would be aware of what the risks are to them, whether or not they help them to develop a plan and a means of getting to those facilities in an expanded way, with the goal being that in the 21st century in Spokane, Washington, no one should be dying of extreme heat events. So that is the basic project in a nutshell, and I have a couple more slides just about sort of sharing about how to learn more about our work, and then I'd love to chat with you all about any questions, comments, or ideas that you have about this emerging work. Before we go to the Q&A, I would mention that next Tuesday we have a free Zoom event on the credibility of climate models with a climate modeling scientist, Dr. John Abatsoglu from the University of California at Merced. And then next January, we're going to actually have a whole slate of events next semester, but the first one on January 30th, which is in person, Dr. Christopher Preston from the University of Montana on geoengineering. If you're interested, you can go to gonzaga.edu/climate center events and register for those free events. The second one actually is probably not posted yet, but will be this week. We'll post our spring lineup of lectures that we're going to be hosting. And here are ways of learning more about the project that I've been mentioning tonight. These are the short versions of these links. And so you can go to the heat survey, you can learn about the heat maps, you can learn just about the Beat the Heat project, or you can contact us at any time at climatecenter@gonzaga.edu. And so with that, I'm going to pause and hope to get some feedback from folks who are assembled.
All right. Do you hear me, Dr. Henning?
Yep, sounds good.
All right, perfect. So we do have some questions, and we're gonna tuck into those in just a second. But I just bear in mind, you know, we sort of harvest questions before we hear the presentation. So some of the questions aren't going to be precisely around, you know, Spokane and the investigation on heat maps and interventions. But we'll, you know, some are. So bear with us with these questions because they get broad. So the one question I do have directly about what your work covers sounds great, makes a lot of sense. Seems like we're trying to surgically identify and mitigate right where we need to. So it sounds super efficient. I can only hope and wonder, are you aware of other cities doing this? Because it seems like a lot of cities need to.
Yeah, so the NOAA project that the NOAA grant that we got is part of an annual project that seems to have been running for, 4 or 5 years, I think is the correct number, something like that. They seem to have a cohort of 12 to 15 cities each year that does this urban heat island mapping. And so we're the only one in the Northwest this year. but Portland and Seattle have done it in the past, and then they're spread around the country, and there are 2 sites internationally. So in terms of that, a good first step of getting better information about your community, this federal program through NOAA is a nice way that communities across the country are doing these community science programs where volunteers are collecting data about their communities. So it seems to be a nice first step. And I'm glad that Chris Crocker at the news, at the weather office at KXLY shared that grant opportunity with us so we could take advantage of it.
Right on. Okay, good to hear. All right, I'm going to get to the first question, then we're probably going to go back and forth with the other moderator. But for now, anyway, there seems to be a general agreement that we cannot achieve the 1.5 degree target per the Paris Accords. Given this, what do you think, given your expertise, a realistic target should be? So what do you think the realistic target should be? And whatever that answer is, to the extent you can, what do you think the impacts will be?
Yeah, so for everybody who's not as wonky about these things, so just a background context. So the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015 committed the nations of the world, all agreed that we need to limit ourselves to no more than 2 degrees Celsius past pre-industrial levels, and preferably less than 1.5 degrees Celsius. And the reason that those numbers were chosen, there was grounded in quite a bit of science, which suggested that around 2 degrees Celsius additional warming, a number of ecosystems are feared to unravel so much that it makes it maybe incompatible with a lot of large scale human projects, a lot more worry about large scale ecosystem collapse and species extinction. So that 2 degrees is seen as the guardrail, and we want to be on this side of the guardrail. And 1.5 is even better. At 1.5, a number of island nations would disappear past 1.5, and so you already have quite a bit of impact. So, to get to this question, 1.5 is looking really hard, like increasingly less and less likely because we're just not taking the problem seriously enough and we're not acting quickly enough. We've already brought about 1.1 degrees Celsius warming since industrial era, since the late 1800s. And so that means we only have 4/10 or three or 4/10, until we go past that 1.5 degrees. But I think there's a sense in which we can also overemphasize these thresholds. There's something magical about the threshold. There are scientists attempt to imagine how much we could withstand. But the truth of the matter is each 1/10 of a degree warming means that much bigger storms, that much bigger wildfire season, that much bigger precipitation events, floods, that it's not like we get to 1.5 or 2 and then everything happens. We already see the effects. And so it's true in the negative side. It's true that in the sense that it's each 1/10 of a degree, things are worse. It's also true in the opposite. Each 1/10 of a degree we avoid or reduce means that many fewer people died, that many fewer storms happen. I heard today that there was probably the flooding in Pakistan last summer probably caused $30 billion worth of damage. And that's just one storm, one event in one country. So any actions we take means that we have fewer and fewer impacts. And so I guess I'd say we need to do as much as we can, as quickly as we can.
Right.
And instead of looking at it as sort of like success or failure, not be tempted to look at it as a binary, but as a more linear, a linear problem.
Right. Okay. So we kind of know what's going to happen generally. It's just a matter of how intense it's going to get.
That's largely true.
Yeah.
To be disagreeing with myself only slightly, because I am a philosopher and I have to do that by law. There's the possibility that there are what they call nonlinear threshold events. There are the possibilities of dramatic, of tipping points. It's just that we don't exactly know where they are. And we don't,
Right.
So it's possible that we have unpleasant surprises that we want to avoid, and the more warming we have, the more likely we'll trip over one of these. But in general, the problem is each 10th equals that much worse. And so it's good to focus on doing as much as we can, as quickly as we can, as responsibly as we can, because each 10th matters to the who's affected, how much is affected, and how expensive.
Yep, totally understand. So we have a question from the group. And this might have been a logistic thing or a funding thing, but they're curious to know, why wasn't the Spokane Valley included in the study?
Yeah, it really was just a practical concern. We needed some way of defining our scope. And so we had the logistical ability and the funding to be able to do this city, not because we didn't want to have the opportunity to think about how to map out the effects on the valley as well. We just had to start somewhere. The community survey itself is also focused on the city of Spokane. So it's kind of our starting point. But I will say that, so although our data are focused on the city because we needed a place to start and we're small and still scrappy and getting going, that our goal is to be as helpful to the whole inland Northwest region as we can. I'd love for the Climate Center at Gonzaga to be useful to not just Spokane County, but to much of the outlying regions around here. A bunch of small towns on the Palouse could use a lot of help. As we saw with Malden, that 80% of which burned to the ground due to probably fire made worse by climate change. Those communities need help as well. So we are in initial conversations with the Spokane County Emergency Manager about potentially applying for a joint grant that would focus on helping the entire Spokane County, including Spokane Valley. So would have been nice to have done more, and we hope to continue to, but we needed a place to start.
Yeah. As a project manager, I get the scope thing, believe me. Okay, next question. It's a lot of reading here. I got to set this question up, so hang with me. The Guardian recently published an article on the loss of a permanent ice cap in the Arctic. It said, even if planet heating emissions are radically cut, the world's vast ice sheets at the poles will continue to melt away for hundreds of years, causing up to 3 meters of sea level rise that will imperil coastal cities, the report states. The terminal loss of sea ice from the Arctic during summers could arrive within a decade and now cannot be avoided, it adds. This suggests at least one tipping point has already been reached. Can you comment, first of all, does that jive with your understanding, number one? Number two, can you comment on other tipping points that might be realistically avoided?
Yeah, so the Arctic, one of the scary things about the way that warming is being felt on the planet is that it seems to be more dramatic at the North Pole in the way that heat is circulating. It's quite a bit worse in the Arctic than it is in the mid latitudes, interestingly. And so it is possible. Part of what we need to do to understand this question about the Arctic and whether or not it's already past a certain tipping point is that the main driver of the change of our climate is greenhouse gas emissions that trap a certain amount of heat in our atmosphere for a longer period of time. Carbon dioxide is the biggest culprit there, and carbon dioxide lasts in the atmosphere for on average a century. And that's important to know to answer this question, because that's behind this idea that part of the problem is that we have enough emissions already in the atmosphere to continue to warm the planet for quite a while. There's this delay. It's a long-lived problem because a lot of the warming that we're currently experiencing was actually caused by carbon dioxide released by our parents and grandparents. And the warming that our current emissions is going to continue to cause warming for a century, that'll cause warming for our grandchildren and their children. And so that's partly what's behind this idea about whether or not the Arctic is already, there's a certain amount of warming already built into the system because of the amount of greenhouse gases we've already put in the atmosphere. The only part of the question that I'd want to get more clarification on has to do with the 3 meters of sea level rise. The Arctic ice cap is floating on open ocean. There's no land mass below that ice. And that's important. It's sea-based ice. And it's very important for a number of reasons. One of them is that it's a white surface that reflects a lot of light. And when you melt that ice, you're replacing a white surface with a darker surface, open ocean. And that means that you increase the rate of warming. But in terms of sea level rise, when you melt the Arctic ice cap, you don't change the sea level at all. The analogy that people usually use is if you have a glass and all the ice is below the edge, is below the edge. So if you have a glass and all the ice is inside and none of the ice is above the top, even though it's all the way full, when that ice melts, it doesn't spill out, right? The ice is floating on the water, and as it melts, it's already displacing a certain amount of that water. So it wouldn't change sea level. I suspect what the article was referring to is probably Greenland, which is in the Northern Hemisphere. And it was probably talking about the amount of melting of the Greenland ice sheet, which could cause quite a bit of sea level rise. And how much and how fast is hotly debated. There's a lot of worry about it, but I wouldn't want to conjecture exactly how much and how fast, because I don't think we have a really, really good idea. But that would be the only part that I'd push back on. I don't know if I feel like I'm forgetting one part of the question, Jeff.
Yeah, no, the other part is, can you comment on other tipping points that we might be able to avoid?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if if we mean by tipping points, we mean these thresholds that I was talking about, these nonlinear threshold events when we cross these certain thresholds. Weakening of the jet stream. There's worry that will cause a tipping point. There's worry that we will have peat bogs. We'll start releasing carbon in large amounts. There's a lot of methane locked up in crystals in the ocean. As the oceans heat, there's worried that a lot of that methane will be released, and that creates a spiral. So I think there are all sorts of positive and negative feedback loops. So there are a lot of problems where we're doing things that are causing an effect, and that effect causes more warming, which causes more of that same effect. So for example, you get more warming, which causes more evaporation, which makes forests more arid, which makes them more susceptible to bigger forest fires. And when you have a big forest fire, you release more carbon dioxide, which makes more heating.
That's
and so it spirals up. Yeah. So I don't know if those are tipping points, but I think that sometimes because of movies, we sometimes over exaggerate. Like all of a sudden there'll be not that the question is coming from somebody who's making that mistake, but we sometimes like imagine like all of a sudden tomorrow there'll be, crazy effects. It's more of the frog in the pot of water problem. It's more that it gets shifting baseline each year. We just forget like when it used to be spring or when it used to be fall, and we forget what October used to be like, and it just our baseline shifts a little bit, and now we just get used to smoke season. Oh yeah, we've got smoke season now. I remember now that's just normal, and that's the bigger problem, that we don't notice the gradual shift as much as we should.
Right on. Okay, great. So any of my panelists have any questions they want to introduce?
I have one for Dr. Henning. So the ultimate goal of the project is to, I'm asking, is the ultimate goal of the project to help municipalities, cities, governments to address the problem of these urban heat islands and how to prevent them, or how to plan cities better? I guess
Yeah. Yeah, let's go back to the sort of practical brass tacks, because that is a lot of what is motivating our work here. What are we looking for? I would love for the city of Spokane to invite us to help develop a more comprehensive heat action plan, is what a lot of cities call them. So there's a they're like what to do in the event of a major heat event, and there's this nice detailed plan. Lots of communities are developing them. The Climate Center would love to be invited by the city to help to develop that more comprehensive plan, so that we would be better prepared next time we have an event. So that's sort of top of mind of thinking about that. There's also things that the community can and should do. So we're going to do an educational campaign with the health district, so that people learn about the dangers, learn about how to prepare them for themselves and their family, how to help especially people with fewer resources to be better prepared. For example, FEMA has a grant program that we're hoping to apply for some money. FEMA, typically is sort of the pound of, the pound of cure side of things. You have a natural disaster and FEMA helps communities rebuild. We get that part, but there's also another part of FEMA that is the sort of the ounce of prevention side of FEMA. And increasingly, they're providing money for communities to be able to do this planning and resilience work. And so we're hoping to apply for money along with the Spokane County Emergency Manager, and maybe the Department of Health, to create what might be called a resilience hub in Spokane, so that the community would be more resilient to the changes that are coming. So concrete plans. And that's number one. And then I'd really love to figure out a way to find community assets. I'm thinking of not only the libraries, which have been used last summer. The city used 4 libraries last summer as cooling shelters, but I'd like to see that as an expanded network that would include all the community centers, maybe some of the senior centers, and that those centers would all be hardened, as I mentioned earlier, so that they would be able to be community assets that would withstand an extreme heat event, probably also smoke as well. And then work with STA and other community partners to provide transportation and provide those materials in multiple languages. So we'd have community plans and community assets for the benefit of the community, where we could even use elementary schools, as some communities do that. So anyway, those are the sorts of ideas I had, Mark, about that. But really, it should be a community conversation. So the center has ideas, but we'd really love to see ourselves as facilitators and partners within the community. We've got a problem, and now, can we develop plans and direct community assets and resources to be better prepared? That's the main goal.
Thanks. And then another follow-up question. As Jeff asked earlier, if you could identify other cities that are doing this, but I guess I have read in the news that the problem that is particularly acute in Europe, where they're not used to heat like they've had recently. Have you seen any international type efforts for similar to yours?
I don't know about Europe. I don't know if this is going to show up. Let me know if this is coming through. Okay, this is the 2022 locations. I don't know if that's that might not be big enough. Let me see if I can you see that at all?
Yeah, it's great.
So that's the cohort for this year. There's another map that shows all the cities that have done it since the start of the program. And there were a couple of, I guess this map doesn't show it, there are a couple of international locations, but they weren't in Europe. I think they were in developing nations that were also part of this network. So, what we found in the 2021 heat dome is that there were places like Seattle and Portland that had extremely high temperatures, and British Columbia in particular, but their infrastructure is not used to it. They don't, the air conditioner needs historically have not been there. When I was in college in Seattle, I bought a little compact car, and the base model didn't even come with air conditioning. You could, because you didn't need it in Seattle. And then I moved to New York, and regretted it. So Portland and Seattle don't have it. Spokane has quite a bit more air conditioning, but not as much as you'd think, because we have really, really high levels of poverty in Spokane. And so those are some issues. But Europe, I know a little bit less about in terms of whether or not they have funding mechanisms and programs like this to better understand heat in their areas and plan. But the general idea of heat action planning is getting to be pretty common now. Most cities of our size many cities of our size have already done that. So I feel like we're a little bit behind on that. And there's plenty of resources. So I think that we're ready to jump on this opportunity. The 2020 Heat Dome gives us the reason, sort of reminds us about what's at stake. And so I don't know. Unfortunately, I don't know as much about the European question, though.
Yeah, well, I mean, look what happened to London, right? Another place that's ill-equipped for
A lot
heat,
like Seattle.
and they got hit with 104 for a week or something like that. So I'd imagine they're doing something.
Yeah, and how much humidity you have makes a whole heck of a lot of difference as well. So these so-called wet bulb temperatures, it's really interesting, but the more humidity, you can have higher temperature but lower humidity. Like Death Valley is nasty, but in Southern California, you can survive heat that's much higher because the humidity is so low. Whereas you could have lower temperatures but higher humidity that could be more dangerous because it prevents your body's ability to cool off. And so a lot of communities in the world, I don't think London is one of them, but have that problem as well, have really bad humidity. So it's a problem that a lot of communities are dealing with, and so Spokane needs to focus attention on this, and we have plenty of resources to do it. We just need to focus our attention there. It's not primarily a problem for unhoused people, although of course they're affected, and we should concern ourselves to make sure that they're cared for as well. But the evidence suggests that it's actually a problem, especially for elderly people. We just sent out 350 surveys to homebound seniors through Meals on Wheels just this week to try and learn more about the challenges that homebound seniors are having. So we're hoping to be able to make recommendations that'll tell a clear and coherent story about exactly how heat is affecting different community members.
Okay, great. Next question. Climate change is obviously top of mind throughout the world, and given this, I guess I'd frame this question as a little different than how it's written here, but I work for Kaiser Permanente, and I once heard this thing that the CEO put out years ago, right? And I'm just using this to frame the question, but we have, at the time, I don't know if we had 500,000 people with diabetes under care, might have been a few more. And it was basically, if we could get 20% of these people to lose 10 pounds or to walk a half hour 4 times a week, we would save $5 billion a year, right? And the numbers might be off, but it was like that. It was that kind of, if we could just have this small-ish population do this small-ish thing, the gains would be unreal, right? And so bear that in mind as the frame for, what could individuals do, right? In that sense, if there's something, given that everyone knows about this, or a lot of people are sensitive to it, what could we tell them to do that would have the most impact?
Yeah, it's a fair question. That I have like 2 different kinds of answers. One that's true but not helpful, and one that's not true but is helpful. So again, sorry,
it's all right.
It turns out I still am a philosopher, but so the true but unhelpful answer is one that climate author and activist Bill McKibben gives, when he's asked, what can I as an individual do to address the climate crisis, he says, that you can be less of an individual, that we need to have systemic changes. There are things we can do as individuals, but many of the problems we're having right now are the level of the systems that we've designed for ourselves as people, and that we need to focus our attention on changing those systems by becoming politically active, by changing the systems, by passing new laws and regulations. So for example, last week, the Washington State Building Code Council passed a new code that requires all new residential dwellings in the state of Washington by a certain date to no longer use fossil fuels, but to use electricity for heating. So I think we're the first state, one of the first states in the nation to require this for all new residential, and they already did it for commercial. That's an example of not just getting individuals to put solar panels on their houses, which they should do if they can afford it, but that it changes how houses are going to be built, and that's a systemic change. Another example, I can choose how much electricity I use. I can choose to be more efficient. I should look for ways of weatherizing, closing gaps, reducing the amount of electricity, being less wasteful. But I can't control how the electrons that come out of my electrical socket are produced. That Avista decides that, our utility. And so it's important to pass laws like the Clean Energy Transformation Act in 2018, which requires all utilities in the state of Washington to transition to renewable electricity by law on a certain time scale, 80% by 2030, 100% by, or 95% by 2045, or 2045. So that's the first answer. The true answer, but unhelpful, is we need to change systems. The less true, but still helpful answer about what you can do as an individual is use tools like the one on your screen here. This is a tool called, let's see, I'll show the URL there at the top. So if you live in around Spokane, go to sustainablespokane.org, and it's a tool that does a couple things. It helps you to calculate what your own impact is on the climate. So you answer questions about your transportation and your diet and your energy use and your home. And then it tells you how impactful your actions are. That's useful if you've ever done a footprint calculator that has a nice footprint calculator that it uses. And then the second thing that's even more useful that it does is it gives you all sorts of ideas for what you could do to make that smaller, to reduce your impact. And what's cool about the website is that it has suggestions that are, many of the suggestions incorporate Spokane specific information. So it has information about our composting program, the Spokanescape program, the Spokanopy program, that it has actions and activities that you can do that are Spokane specific. We've even developed a version of this that's used in the local high schools for a competition during Earth Week, where they call the Spokane Climate Cup, where high school students do this, and you can sort the actions by things that renters could do, or things that youth could do, and things like that. So that's the other thing we can do. I don't know if that helps, Jeff, in terms of two different kinds of answers.
No, it makes sense. I mean, it's not, the example I gave the Kaiser diabetes patients is it's contained, it's not, there's not like all this other stuff that underlies it, right? So that's why it's an easy soundbite. But what you're talking about is so baked in at so many levels, it's just doesn't lend itself.
But it still does, there's still a sense in which if everybody did X small action, it really would have an amazing impact. Like if everybody ate one less, like if chose one day a week to not eat meat, it would actually have a surprisingly large impact on the climate, for example. Another one, if you want to know exactly this project, if you've never looked at it, called Project Drawdown, they actually do, I think, closest to what you're asking, Jeff, which is, they say, don't just tell me what seems most popular, tell me actually what would be the biggest bang for the buck. And it goes through all these different strategies, but it ranks them according to exactly how big of an impact it would have. So for example, educating women in developing nations is like one of the biggest ones you could have, or doing refrigeration management to make it so that you don't have refrigerants escaping into the atmosphere, which are, you know, really intense greenhouse gases, things you wouldn't expect. If you did, would have a outsized effect, and so they kind of score them all that way. So if you want to nerd out on the data, the drawdown website is really good for that. I saw a question from Chris in the Q&A about smoke. If it's okay, I'll
go ahead
up on that. Because I am interested in that question that Chris asks about smoke. In the next phase of our project, after we work on heat, I would like to transition to smoke. Heat and smoke are probably the two biggest impacts on our area, and so are the logical ones to focus on. In fact, I'm just in the earliest stages of trying to figure out how we would do a little bit of data gathering on that. So what I'm envisioning is doing a study where we would locate sensors indoors and outdoors on a mixture of residential, commercial, and municipal buildings across the city. And we would do it for a whole summer, like let's say May through October, something like that. And my goal would be not just to do the AQI sort of real-time data, because we've got plenty of sensors around the city that give you real-time data. What I'm interested in is across the city, what's the difference between the air quality in a particular location, indoor versus outdoor? So what's that difference, that differential between indoor and outdoor at a particular location? And how does home and housing stock and infrastructure affect that? I suspect, and I don't have the evidence to prove it, I suspect there are community members whose indoor air quality is as bad or worse than outside. And it's not always clear when to close your windows and why, especially depending on if you have central air or you have a window unit, and all these questions that people, they're like, I'm not sure what I even should do when it's really bad air quality outside. And so I'm hoping to do another phase of this that would focus on smoke. And it would be logical that the community would use the same community assets that would be cooling shelters, should probably also be safe air shelters. The city council recently passed a new ordinance saying that there would be safe air shelters that would be opened when the air quality index gets past, my recollection is something like 200, but it might have been 150. But past a certain point, they would open safe air shelters, which they actually just meant the homeless shelters is really all they've meant. And I could be wrong about this. I'm going to try and find out and get evidence about it. But the Trent Avenue homeless shelter that was just opened is a former warehouse. I would be shocked if it had any capacity to provide safe air. I don't think it has the infrastructure to do it. And so the idea that it would be a safe air shelter, anyway, there's not any, I don't think there's any good reason to believe that that is the case. And so we need to gather some better evidence to be able to understand that and how it's impacting our community, so we can give people better advice about when to open their windows, when to keep them closed, how to clean their indoor air. This is the world we're in, and we don't have particularly good advice for Spokane yet, but that's the next phase of the project. So thanks for asking that question. It's on my mind as well.
All right, great. And Mark, do you have another one chambered? If not, I do.
I don't, but you did have one I saw about COP27, and as Dr. Henning was talking about, speaking of places that are hot and humid, Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt is certainly that description. So do you mind if I ask the question, Jeff?
Yeah, have at it.
So COP27 is going on right now, or I think it's still going on in Egypt. And have you been following any of the progress there, and anything notable that you are hearing or seeing?
Yeah, I'm trying my best to follow that. And the big news out right now is that the developing nations were successful in getting, for the first time, the richer nations to include on the official agenda a discussion of what's referred to euphemistically as loss and damage. So we're in this situation where the rich nations, the developed nations, have created a lot of pollution that is warming the planet, and that pollution is having disproportionate effect on people who did not cause the problem or very much of the problem. So people in Bangladesh, or people on low-lying nations, people in Pakistan created very, very little, have very small footprints, but they just had epic floods, right? For example, in Pakistan, if you saw any of those videos. So their view is that on the polluter pays model, their view is that we know what the historical responsibility is for having caused the problem, and their view is that on the polluter pays, on a principle of fairness, on a principle of justice, that developed nations should help and compensate, not out of the kindness of their heart, but out of a sense of justice and responsibility, those developing nations that are suffering the consequences. They cause the least amount of the problem, they suffer the biggest amount of the problems, and they have the fewest resources with which to respond. So there's a deep injustice in that. So that's the big news, that it's finally on the agenda. It's been kept off the agenda for the last few years, and so they were successful in getting it on there. Now, whether anything will come, the loaded phrase that people are throwing around is the idea of climate reparations, and I think that's an unhelpful formulation because of its connotations to slavery or other sorts of things. But the idea is compensating nations for the harm done and helping them adapt. There's some reasonability to that. So that's the big news that I've heard so far, Mark. But they still have another, I think, week and change. So all the big news will come out toward the end, and so it's all just sort of sausage making right now, I think.
Thank you.
Yeah, staying on that topic of COP27, I was just happened to catch a news article in the BBC that something like there are 600 plus fossil fuel affiliated attendees, and I guess previously it was like somewhere in the 500s. So it seems like the fossil fuel industry is wanting to have a seat at the table rather than get eaten, as they put it in the article. And what was interesting is there are several from African countries who are very keen to extract fossil fuels. And they want, obviously, the funds to pay for the development of their country, their infrastructure, their growth, et cetera. And so it's this, bizarre conundrum, because on the one hand, you have to get us to the developed countries to, sort of pay, create justice and pay for our sins, as it were, that they must suffer. And on the other hand, the African countries want to extract fossil fuels and pay for their infrastructure. So, I mean, what a god awful mess, right? I mean, there's just conundrums everywhere. So, it's sort of, I guess I don't know what my question really is here. It's just, broadly speaking, what a mire. And how do you, as a client scientist, someone who's, obviously has a great deal of expertise and commitment to this subject, I mean, how do you reconcile these kinds of things? Or do you?
Yeah, we've created a system which is doing a good job of defending itself right now, right? Because we've got the largest, most profitable countries or companies in the world, right, that are all based upon digging up ancient carbons and methane stores and using it for energy. And we didn't know that was causing a problem. Now we do, but it's literally trillions of dollars worth of wealth, and much of that wealth is already today reflected in the stock prices of those companies. So that it's just to add to the difficulty of your problem that you're pointing out. The Exxon Mobils of the world, for example, their ledger sheet is today reflects not just the oil that they can sell, but the known and proven reserves they have access to is already reflected in their balance sheets, which means that billions and potentially trillions of dollars worth of wealth, if they don't realize it, then right, they're writing down all, and they're losing all of that value. So whatever happens, I don't see a way that we don't figure out a way to make those companies whole in some way, right? We don't have it's hard to imagine that we wouldn't do that. We're in the midst of a transition right now, and the transition energy-wise, that transition is different even now than it was 3 or 4 years ago. It's happening really fast. This is not like when, Carter put solar panels on the White House and then Reagan took them off, and the market, the venture capital market for renewables collapsed shortly thereafter. We're in a very different situation now because the renewable market is now out competing a number of different fossil energy sources head to head. In fact, arguably, because they're less subsidized, they're beating them, even though fossil energy is so heavily subsidized and artificially assisted in the marketplace. So wind in particular, but also solar, is beating coal head to head, and coal's going out of business largely because it can't economically compete. But methane and oil are another story. And so these developing nations are rightly saying, we want to feed our people and pull our people out of poverty, and we're going to use the cheapest things to do that, including if it's dirty. If we've got access to forms of energy that are going to cause climate change, we have no choice. You did it. Now it's our turn to do it. And so you're right. How do we fix that problem? Economists tell us that the best way to do it is to put a price on carbon pollution, because if you do that, then the true cost to all of humanity of using fossil energy is internalized to the price. Right now, the $30 billion that the floods in Pakistan caused last year, the cost is real, but it's externalized. It's not reflected in the cost of oil and gas and coal. Same thing with huge storms in the United States or wildfires, or you name it, when we have many tens of or hundreds of billions of dollars in damages. So their view is that, I don't know if this is an answer to maybe an impossible question, Deb, but it's how to economically internalize those costs so that that people, including developing nations, would pursue cleaner forms of energy, because dirtier forms of energy would have to pay their true cost. They would actually reflect the true damage that they were doing to the community. But it doesn't look likely that we're going to be creating that sort of system. So then what's the alternative? And that's the situation we're trying to figure out right now. We're creating, Paris is a completely voluntary system, and there are no teeth, and we're all holding ourselves accountable. And so we say to ourselves, we can't possibly withstand more than 2 degrees. We shouldn't try to withstand more than 1.5 degrees. But when we add up all the commitments that nations have made so far, we get to 2.9 degrees Celsius, which, so, the ambition gap is huge. And so we aren't willing to force ourselves to do it. And so we're in this problem where things continue to get worse. Eventually maybe things will get bad enough that we'll not be able to handle it anymore, and we'll force ourselves to take these more. The longer we wait, the more expensive it is, and the more people who die, right? So that's the basic problem. A lot of arguments that when the building council passed these new codes for residential building codes, that it's going to be too expensive, and we they just have to remember that the longer we wait, the longer we rely on these fossil energy sources, the more dramatic, the more disruptive, the more expensive the changes we're going to have to make, and vice versa. The sooner that we make them, the more gradual we can make them, the less disruptive, the less expensive. So,
Yeah, we
Yeah.
discount our future.
We do.
We're like teenagers, you know.
We do.
just can't.
What discount rate you pick makes a whole heck of a lot of
Yeah.
difference. And discount rates are probably inherently unuseful when you're talking about phenomena that last a century, because
Right.
anything on a century time horizon becomes worthless. And that means
Mm-hmm.
the future becomes worthless. And
Yeah.
but we don't believe that. So why would we use discount rates of 5% for,
Mhm.
it's just sort of anyway, there was a Nobel Prize in economics won, by Ted Nordhaus on this, arguing on what the discount rate should be, and there are disagreements. The Stern argues it should be, what did he say, 3%, and Nordhaus argues 5%. But anyway, either way, it's not clear that
Right.
that's the right model to use when you're talking about long-lived, things like carbon in the atmosphere.
Yeah. Well, the carbon market, yeah, that would probably do it. But that right now is a third rail, relatively speaking. It
seems that way, yeah. Other than
now.
the citizens' climate lobby is the only folks who are advocating for that, and it's a tough road. And we rejected it as voters twice in Washington State. It was on the ballot. And what's odd or frustrating is you mentioned the oil companies at COP27. They say they're for a carbon tax, but then every time one appears on a ballot, they dump millions of dollars into the race to kill it. And so it's hard to not see them as bad actors in this system. So
yeah. Okay. I know. We just got to keep plugging away. Anyway, speaking of which, let me get some more questions to you. I'm going to skip around here. So if you could go back in time, we had a magic wand, I could take you back in time 30 or 40 years. What would you, if you were in charge and you held the magic wand, what would you do differently in terms of the approach? And when I say approach, I mean messaging, strategy, big picture, in order to get people on board, right? So not tactics. I have a separate question about actual tactics, but just broadly speaking, would you frame this differently? And if so, how?
Oh, frame it differently. That was the talk that I was going to give that I didn't give. That was going to be my climate ethics talk. That was my 2015 book on the Riders in the Storm book, about 3 different ways of framing what it would be to truly fix the problem, and looking at 3 different answers. So, when you put it in terms of going back, decades, and how we would have framed it differently, I couldn't help but remember what was going on in the Nixon administration and Exxon's scientists at the time. Both were aware of the problem, and both were worried about the problem. Exxon had some of the best scientists in the world, and they were aware of the problem. They knew the science, and they were even initially interested in responding to it. And so was the Nixon administration. So I guess what I'd love to see is, I don't know if this is a tactics question or a framing question, that I would love to have seen a different result if we had zigged instead of zagged in reaction to that key moment when we learned, we were aware of it, and then there was a choice made by certain people to say, this is really not in our best interest. We're going to pretend we didn't know this. And then we lost, 15 to 20 years worth of time until we get to the late 80s, early 90s, when it becomes back on the international scene. So I guess that's the moment I would change, but that's not, I'm probably not quite fully answering your question.
That's all right. It's just, I don't know what we would do different. It was just, I feel like there was a point in time when everyone was sort of on the page in a way. I mean, the Republicans were historically all about conservation and the environment. And like you said, Nixon didn't he start the EPA or something? I mean,
and the Clean Air Act and the Clean Water Act. And
it just got politicized.
Or there was a time even, it's hard to imagine this, but there was a commercial series you can look up on, I think you'll find it online, when the commercial was just a couch in the center of the frame, and it was 2 politicians sitting on the couch, both talking about global warming. And the most vivid one is Nancy Pelosi and Newt Gingrich sitting on the couch together saying climate change is real and it's a problem. So there was like this weird short window when the most partisan of partisans, and then, so there's a great book called The Merchants of Doubt by Naomi Klein and Eric Conway, and there's a movie version of it that's quite entertaining as well. The Merchants of Doubt is all about, so that the premise is that if a small group of dedicated people can really fight hard to make the world a better place, a la the Dr. Kings of the world, it's also true in reverse, that a small group of dedicated people can actually also use their intelligence to make the world a worse place, and traces from the end of the Cold War through the tobacco litigation, through public health fights to the climate change, were all the same group of hired brains who were overly outsized influence, and so purveyors of Merchants of Doubt sort of as the theme. So it's well documented that Naomi Klein is Naomi Oreskes is a science historian at Harvard, so it's a really well argued, careful book. So that would be if you want to get depressed, but it's an interesting argument because it traces it and documents it across that period of time from the end of the Cold War through to, these congressional testimony on climate change. It's the same group of scientists who are all doing expert testimony on each of these public environmental health problems, each over and over again, and traces their outsized influence.
Right on. Okay, thanks. You did earn a PhD. You know everything about this. I believe you. You earned it. Okay, so there was a follow-up question of the same vein. If you could go back 30 or 40 years, what tactical thing? And that's sort of a loaded question. And it really is how do you feel about nuclear, right? It seems to be making a resurgence. Unfortunately, it's late, but better late than never. But what's your thought on it?
Well, on nuclear in particular, or tactics in general?
Yeah, well, tactics in general. If you could go back
and by
in time.
Tactics, do you mean technology, or do you mean political tactics?
Both, really.
I mean, technology-wise, we could have had electric cars a lot earlier, and we could have had renewables a lot earlier. We did. We just didn't choose to incentivize, deploy them, subsidize them because of fossil interests. So that we definitely could have been working on that since the 60s when we learned about the problem. And if Exxon had decided to be an energy company instead of an oil company, it could be the world's largest, purveyor of renewable energy if it had wanted to. So the technologies and the combinations of those, and if we had deployed it gradually over that period of time, we'd all be having electric heat pumps instead of having, fossil infrastructure. So the transition would have been gradual and less noticeable. So nuclear, it is a hot button for environmentalists that don't agree, and climate activists don't agree. So my own view on it is it's a largely, once it's built, it's a largely non-emitting source. It's kind of crazy right now, in my opinion, to imagine pulling any of those resources down. So any resource that's safe, that's already built, we should keep using while it's safe, as we try and bring about a transition. So we need as much non-emitting electricity as we can. Building new is the harder thing, and we got a lot of, so if we set aside the new generation of reactors sort of question about whether or not we're talking about something different. If we're talking about like the same thing we've been doing for decades, there's not a community. Typically, the regulatory and timeline sort of questions seem to have killed every project, right? So it's just very expensive and very time consuming compared to the amount of energy you end up getting. So no community ends up wanting to have it in their back. So the NIMBY problem is severe enough that they don't get built. And the Fukushima, disaster, when you had the tsunami, the earthquake, and the meltdown of Fukushima in Japan was right at the worst possible time for the nuclear industry, because there was just about to be a resurgence, and then everybody was like, oh no, look what just happened. And so, environmentalists sometimes joke, like, if you have a windmill that falls down, like, there's not like a windmill spill, and there's not a
Right.
radioactive windmill spill, like these problems. So there's some truth to that, but it's I guess the last thing I'd add, or not the last thing, but another thing that needs to be part of the debate is whether we've been approaching energy generation for too long and too much from a centralized, concentrated, monopolized model, where right now we create these shareholder-owned monopolies or public utility districts. So Avista is a shareholder-owned monopoly regulated by the state, and they create centralized energy distribution centers, and they're very vulnerable to damage. Every time we have a windstorm, just had a windstorm, people lose electricity because it's highly centralized. There's a question about whether or not we shouldn't be trying more to be able to do something more like the way nature works, which is redundant and distributed. So if we had every facility producing some of its electricity, you couldn't be 100%, but it would be more redundant and more distributed and more resilient to change. So that when you have a windstorm, if you were producing some of your own electricity in your own home or in your own neighborhood, and that could be distributed on a microgrid, then it's, one power line going down doesn't mean that thousands of people lose electricity. So I think we need to, heavy industry needs large sources of base load. So it's not that we get away from having large energy generation, we don't, but if we could have every facility develop and provide some of its own electricity as a goal, we need a lot less of that centralized distribution. So I think sometimes, in other words, we assume we need to just replace all of the coal plants with the equivalent of solar and wind or whatever. And I think, yes, but we need to actually also look at how to have distributed energy generation, which is community-based and community benefiting. And that system would be better for the community, more resilient, and probably more economic as well.
Yeah, that's it. So, I mean, basically solar panels with a battery, kind of.
That would definitely be a part of it. Yeah, depending on your area. I mean, some people could potentially do a little wind or micro wind turbines or other things. But yeah, in general, a lot of communities would be just incorporating, incentivizing, and subsidizing the distribution of solar and battery generation backup, so that you'd be able to have your own generation and have a microgrid within your neighborhood where you could share in real time across that, so that it would be within the community. You wouldn't be you'd not only be more self-reliant, but you'd be more resilient as a community as well.
Okay. Yeah.
In developing nations, when they've jumped over, there are some communities that have jumped over the highly centralized big electrical lines, big energy distribution. That's the way they do it. They have these microgrids within, solar panels and batteries, and then a way of sharing it with small inverters across different community, different parts of the community. And they don't need big distribution lines then. I mean, it's, they use a lot less electricity, less, sort of appliances and stuff. But I mean, there's a version of that we could do that would provide a good portion of the electricity that would make the community more resilient. And so that doesn't completely get us there, but it definitely would be a big improvement along the way.
Okay. Cool. Another question, just a few more questions. Another kind of conundrum question. There's a lot of them on this topic. So our consumer consumption and population is why we're kind of here, right? And yet, I mean, these things, consumption underpins our economy. And especially now, right? Because we sort of need our economy to keep going. We have inflation, but that's going to come down hopefully, but it's baked in. And so how, and I think you've kind of answered this, but if there's anything else you have to add. So we're built around consumption, but consumption is kind of the problem. How do we How do we face that?
Yeah, there's so on October 28th, just a short while ago, Herman Daly passed away at age 84. And Daly was a World Bank economist who is one of the founders of the branch of economics called ecological economics, which isn't the same as environmental economics. We don't have to get into that level of detail unless you want, but basically he was partly arguing that we don't just need to or want to make consumption sustainable. That's kind of the model we're on right now. It's like, how do we make late stage consumer society more sustainable, last longer? The problem with that, he argues, is that it's not necessarily even making us that happy. Even for the people who get to consume, it's not clear that consumption makes you happy. And an economic model based upon the idea that you need to grow, you need to make more stuff next quarter than you made last quarter forever. The idea of infinite growth, as though growth itself was good, which we're led to believe is sort of an obvious point. His view is that that's inherently unecological, that it guarantees ecological collapse, and that that's the cancer model of economy, where it just grows out of exponentially and ends up destroying itself. So what's the alternative? And so he had developed before he passed away a lot of work and founded a journal on the topic of how do we reorganize the economy in a way that was about trying to create functioning, flourishing human communities within functioning, flourishing biological communities, ecological communities. And so he developed some alternative economic models and measures, replacing things like GDP with alternative indices and measures. So you'd need to go pretty deep. This is a topic I talk a lot about in my environmental ethics class with my students. I guess I'd say anecdotally, a lot of my students, my 20-something students, teenagers and early 20s, are pretty persuaded that consumption alone doesn't make you particularly happy, but they're not clear what the alternative is either. So there's a hunger for something else, but it's not clear what that something else is. And so I would say, in a way, that I think the environmental movement and the climate movement in general, but environmentalism just since the 70s has not done a great job of providing an answer to this question. It's been good at being against pollution, but it hasn't really been clear about what it's for. And that was actually also part of the other talk that I didn't give. The analogy that I give sometimes is comparing the environmental movement to the civil rights movement. The civil rights movement is clear what it's against. It's against segregation, it's against discrimination, it's against racism, and it tries to pass laws to fight against those. But I would say that what really animates the civil rights movement, a la Dr. King, is this vision of this dream, this beautiful future, the beloved community, as he calls it. And I'd say that dream is really what animates and motivates a lot of the fight to make a better world. And arguably, the environmental movement doesn't have an equivalent, robust, positive vision for what, in the talk, I kind of joke that there's this headline in USA Today on Earth Day in 2019 is, imagine we solve the climate crisis. Is it better than today or worse? Is it mud huts and gruel or flying cars and the Jetsons? And neither of those are particularly, I would say, neither of those are particularly actually awesome. And I explained in the talk why, but it hasn't provided a robust third alternative. What's the alternative to those? And so I think environmentalists have failed on that front to provide a positive vision that would inspire people to want to fight to bring it about. And so a lot of good work can be done in that area. And that's why we need more philosophers.
No. I took a philosophy 101 class, and I'm definitely in the pragmatic group, I should say. Yeah, no, I mean, you're right about the vision. I mean, it was Dr. King's vision was very clear cut, very intuitive, right? So, but it doesn't, that's not to say that it couldn't exist. I'm sure it's just a matter of someone finally piecing it together, because I'm sure there's something, right?
I liken
Yeah.
it to an asymptote, right? If you remember geometry, right? Like a asymptote is a line that approaches a limit, but it can only get infinitely closer and closer and closer. It can never reach it. And I think of ideals as those asymptotes that their function is not their achievability, but in defining progress, in defining a direction. The Buddhist monk Thich Nhat Hanh has this great line where he says, if I'm lost and I don't know where I'm going, I look for the North Star, not because I am expecting to get there, but because it gives me my orientation, right? And these dreams, these ideals, these visions are useful, practical, helpful, realistic, not because they're fully achievable, but because they define our direction.
Right.
They define progress. This is progress relative to this ideal. And so I want to get closer and closer and closer and closer. I'll never get perfection, right? Because you'll never get to the it's an asymptotic approach. So I think it's realistic action in pursuit of worthwhile ideals that we need, rather than opposing realism and idealism. I think the status quo is full of ideals, like the idea of infinite consumption as providing happiness, or safety and safety and security through the threat and use of violence, are idealistic. They're never fully achievable. Like we can have infinite growth is idealistic.
Right.
So it's not idealistic versus not idealistic. It's which ideals are worth getting closer to and moving closer to. So the status quo usually just gets to call its ideals realism. And I just reject that idea. Instead, it's like, no, it's got its ideals, and it should have to defend them as being better than the alternatives. And I don't know that it would succeed.
Yeah, well, in lieu of an alternative, currently, yeah, it wins. So
that's true. That's right.
The day may come. All right, so we're going a bit long here. I'll ask one last question for me anyway, and it's hopefully an easy one, not so conundrum laced or depressing, but maybe a little depressing. We talk about electric cars a lot, right? And get more electric cars. And then I've heard, this, like if electric cars went from whatever they are now, 5% to 20%, we would need to double our grid to support the power generation. So I guess the question, how it's phrased here, is on current trend, when would our power generation capacity be able to sustain an auto market with 50% of the automobiles being EVs? Does that make sense?
That's a very specific question.
Or 30 or whatever,
yeah. But the general idea, it's one that is rightly bandied around a lot, because we're finally actually looking like we're going to start realizing that we're moving,
right?
But, like there's, car companies, big car companies, all the car companies are saying they're going to stop building internal combustion engines. That's a big freaking deal, right? That's a real action that's happening on our timescales in our lives. That's a real transformation. We're at the end of the horse and buggy, and we're about to start in on something new. And that's going to have radical repercussions in ways that we can expect, in ways that we can't expect. And so it's fair and responsible to think through as many of these as we can now. Will it require more generation? Almost certainly. How much and when and why is actually really complicated. So Avista Utilities has a guy, Rendell Farley, who's great on this question, and his job is to help Avista as a utility think through this transition to electric cars. And he'd be the person to ask this question in detail to see, he'd be able to give you the data, because they modeled this really carefully in a couple of different ways by law in their integrated resource planning, the IRP process. It's required by the Utilities and Transportation Commission for Washington State. They have to do this on a rolling basis every couple of years. And so anyway, the answer, why it's hard to answer is when you charge and where you charge. So homeowners are able to charge at home, and if they do, they're typically charged at night. Right now, we've got tons of capacity for energy generation, but it's typically not used at night because typically we don't have lights on, TVs on, and all these things on at night. So Avista's view is if a lot of the charging for electric vehicles happens at night, it's not necessarily clear that you would need to just double the generation because you've got basically a ton of capacity. And so from their perspective, they are excited about this because they could make better use of the assets they already have by selling more electricity on off-peak times. So that's an interesting, so that adds an interesting complexity to the question. Of course, if we transition, it will require more generation, but how much is surprisingly hard to answer because it depends on who's charging at what time. And at what rates. And so I can't tell you exactly where those breakpoints are, but Avista and all the utilities in the country are tracking this really carefully. The other thing I'd say is I find it a confusing argument against the transition because typically the people who are making the argument, as I've experienced it, are people who like the status quo and they like capitalism and they like making money. And to my mind, the way that the system is supposed to work is we have more demand. And so we create more supply and people make money. And so like Avista make a lot of their shareholder value comes from building new generation. That's where a lot of their shareholders get the value in the stock. And so if they have to add more generation, they see it coming. They see the trend. They have to make an integrated resource plan I think it's every 3 or 4 years. That's a rolling 10-year horizon. So every 3 or 4 years, they're doing a 10-year plan,
right,
on a rolling basis. So they build more generation, and their shareholders make more money, and we have more electricity. That's how supply and demand works. So I'm not really sure why that we'd need more, yeah. But what I don't understand is
when,
why that's a problem.
Yeah.
Where it could be from environmentalist problem is that it could require a lot more utility lines through sensitive ecological areas. And I do think you're going to have some fights between climate folks and in classical conservation environmentalists, because that solar farm or that power line is going to go through sensitive areas. And so one's going to say, we have a climate emergency, we have to do it. The other's going to be like, no, the desert tortoise habitat. Right. And so that they're going to conflict a lot, but that's kind of like an inter-environmental argument. People who are like, we shouldn't transition to electrical vehicles because we're going to need more generation. I don't know why they'd be worried about it, because they don't typically care about those things. So I mean, so they'd be like, yeah, desert tortoise, whatever. They, let's build stuff. We're good at that. We're Americans. I don't know. I find that confusing. But anyway, the general idea is, yes, we're going to make more generation. We can make more renewable generation. When you get to like a past 90%, it gets a little bit complicated, according to the current models. When we get to around 2040, and that last 10% of the electrical grid is going to be the most challenging because of needs for peak energy demand. You have to be able to produce enough electricity for the peak, annual peak, whether that be in the winter or the summer.
Right.
And so your peak generation requires potentially a massive amount of redundancy that they're worried about. They don't want to have to produce, because it's just really, they're worried about that last little bit,
right,
as being really expensive and really expensive and expansive, in terms of facilities. And I have some sympathy with that last bit. To my mind, it's likely we'll have large scale storage, like pumped hydro storage, for example, that,
right,
that would make it possible to store large amounts of energy more efficiently than chemical batteries can do. And so that they'll probably fix the problem by creating clever ways of storing energy off-peak demand. That would be likely. And we've got, 15 years, 20 years to figure out that last 10%. So I'm reasonably optimistic. I don't tend to bet against engineers as far as that goes.
Right. Yeah, we are clever little apes, aren't we?
Over clever, but yeah. But no, I think that one will do. So I think the EV transition is, I thought we were going to take the question about, them having impacts, and they do, of course, batteries have impacts and all of that we could talk about too. But the general energy generation side, supply and demand, I don't know why it wouldn't work because the time scales are within the time scales that supply and demand could respond. Increased supply of electricity as demand increases with EV use. And Avista has a very nice plan. You should go to their website about EV rollout and their plans and the expectations. And so as long as it's smooth, gradual, and like people don't transition 30% next year, they'll be
right. Okay. Of course, it's gonna be gradual. So
I don't know why it wouldn't be, because cars on average are lasting more than a decade because they're really durably built. And they're freaking expensive. And so like the people hold on to them. And so the turnover is relatively slow. And so the EV infrastructure gets there. My concerns are about low-income residents and renters. Like, how are you going to charge your car if you're a renter? I think we need to think more about how to help rent. You can't throw a line out your window as a renter, and charge your car. That's so. In Spokane, we've got a lot of people who live in those communities, and so I think we need to think about not just we need really good public transit, but we also need to imagine that we still don't have a community that's really well designed for public transit, and so people are going to still be probably using personal cars, and so we probably do need to think about how do we help those community members as well. Homeowners, that's a pretty easy solution, but renters, that one we need to think more about how would we help incentivize that for landlords to create the infrastructure to make that possible. That it would require a little more thought.
Right. But broadly, it's surmountable.
Oh yeah. That one's pretty doable. The basic plan is decarbonize the grid, move transportation to the grid, move heating to the grid. That would solve most of the problem. You'd still have some agricultural emissions. You'd have to reduce meat consumption. But if you did the grid, transportation, and heat, that's the majority of the problem. So that's all doable. We've got the technology to do it. We just need to do it.
Yeah. Okay, great. So I think that's all we have. That's all I see on the board. Mark, do you have anything else, or are you good?
Well, I do have one quick question. I think it's probably the most important question of the evening. How can I win those Gonzaga tickets?
Yeah, let me bring up that slide again. So if you take our survey, and I'll share my screen here. If you go to gonzaga.edu/heat survey, and you complete this 53 question survey, which sounds like a lot, but none of them are open-ended. So they're fairly sort of, just click a button sort of questions. At the end of it, you can opt to include your email address, and doing that would opt you into the drawing for the tickets.
That's my next event.
I hope it is for everybody. We have had a really good survey response so far, and looking very optimistic that we're going to have a large enough sample size to make some really good inferences to the whole community, meaning we'll be able to extrapolate reasonably. We'll have a big enough sample size to say, this is probably the percentage of people who have air conditioners. This is the percentage of people who can't afford to run it, things like that. And so I'm excited about that. But I understand that the community's excited. Like, these are prime seats, like mid-court, at the middle of the lower level, in the middle of the court. So it's like, It's the tickets they give to donors. So they're
good.
really good. They're really good ticket. They're not like where they make the faculty sit up at the not that McCarthy's very big. It's not, but I mean, these are actually good seats. So as well as, it's a game. So
that's all I had, Jeff. And Dr. Henning, I just want to thank you for being with us tonight, and I'll turn it back over to Jeff.
All right. Thanks, Mark. All
Thanks,
right.
everybody.
Some closing statements, right? So I need to say that we're being recorded, and it's important that we mention the legal bits. The views presented by our guest speakers are their own. As a 501c3 nonprofit, PEG neither participates in political campaigns on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate for public office, nor engages in any political activity of any kind. With that said, on behalf of the board and the membership, we cannot thank you enough, Dr. Henning, for this wildly interesting and insightful talk. We appreciate the time you've given us to talk about this vital, has been vital, is vital, will be vital topic. And thanks to the audience. You are so much a part of the work we do. A video of tonight's forum will be posted on PEG's website in a couple of weeks. We also would mention that we do have another forum coming up in December. I do not have the date, but this forum topic will be on the role of the Spokane County Clerk and the success of Veterans Court. Details will be posted on pegnow.org in a few weeks, as I said. And with that, we will leave you, Dr. Henning. Thank you again. It's amazing. Every time we have one of these forums, I pick up a handful of things that you can't read, right? No matter how many articles you read, no matter how many people you talk to, you just can't get to this level of detail and insight. And so for that, I am grateful. Thank you so much for joining us.
It was my pleasure. Thanks, everybody.
All right. Cheers. Good night, all.